Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the CCA CS16. This is one that, especially after the KZ everyone was wondering what this one was going to sound like. And I do want to thank the Luck LZ store, audio store on AliExpress for shipping this one out to me. They shipped out a couple around the globe, so we should actually see a couple more first impressions or full reviews come out in the next week or so. But for those who aren't too familiar with what it looks like or the ASX, so this is the CS16, and if you remember, I'll show you the ASX in a second next to it. ASX had this big white opaque guide in there, but on this one, if you look super close, you could actually see the tubes coming out of the BAs, which is actually kind of nice. But it's very similar in shape to the ASX, but when we just pull it off, and we can see these almost side by side. So the size are very close, but not quite the same. The ASX with its 10 BAs is actually still a little, even on the face side, is actually a little wider, and it's going to be a little harder to see it on camera, but the CS16 is still a little more narrower, even from looking at the back. From the side, it almost looks like the CS16 is extended a little more, but they're quite close, but quite similar. This one, the CS16, does have a little vent. I'm not entirely sure there's actually a vent versus a ornamental feature, but I think it probably is there's probably a small vent behind it. So the way I have it set up, these are ASLA Sedna ear fit. This is the short version, and I have the short version because, one, I bought the short version for the T300, but two, because CCA ships with the CS16 this new style. I mean, this is like a real short nozzle, and you can kind of see the nozzle is pretty much poking in your ear. There's a very little gap there versus the Sedna shorts, which actually adds a little more extension to the nozzle compared to the same. But I wanted to try the shorts anyway for the T300. So also this is a SEMA electrode cable. This is the RX. It's about $38. It is a copper OCC, silver plated OCC. I'll get to why I chose that cable in a second. This is the box that it comes in. It's kind of your standard CCA box. So before we get into it, let's talk about what CCA gave us to begin with, and I'll talk about how it's generally different than the ASX. So the first, there was basically three categories of people with the ASX. There were people who thought it was fine, and I was one of those. There were people who thought that the treble was missing. It was 10 BAs, but you really weren't hearing, a third of them. And a lot of it came down to this kind of roll off at about 5K. And so a lot of people had this impression that it really was missing a big chunk of the treble range. And so it was a bit of a mystery why some people thought it was really nice and some people thought it was really, the signature was way off because it was missing that upper range. And then there was the people who thought the tuning itself, it wasn't necessarily missing treble range, but the tuning itself was just too warm and too bassy. And I sort of agree more on that side, was that tuning for a 10 BA just wasn't going to appeal to everyone, and especially people who were used to buying BAs with maybe a more analytical, a less bassy sound. They delivered something that sounded like 10 BAs trying to be more of a bassy dynamic driver. It's kind of strange, but again, it appealed to probably a third of the people who really, really liked it, and the other 2/3 had issues with it. So what does the CS16 really do tuning wise? And I will say it kind of resembles this. You still have some bass, but they notched it down, so you don't have that persistent, overdone bass that you sort of we're talking about with the ASX, and I tried cables and tips just to get that under control. And the bass is sort of almost not noticeable, and for the most part with the CS16. It's not the problem area. It's not that fly in the ointment that I couldn't get past on the ASX. So I think they brought this down a little bit, and it becomes really flat, and then this is elevated a little bit. So my first impression was really it sounded like the ASX, but just a little brighter. And then the more you listen to it, you realize that the bass is actually notched down quite a bit, and it actually fades out quicker. And maybe that's just because they notched down the level, but it definitely is less persistent. Doesn't overstay its welcome like it did on the ASX. And at the same point, you have sort of this same middle section, which was really nice on the ASX anyway. It's just not overly warm the way it was on the ASX. So generally, I think they sort of seesawed this. They brought one side down and bumped this one up a little bit. But this, treble area looks pretty much the same. So for those folks who paid $90 for the ASX, I probably wouldn't double down and think that the CS16 is going to be radically different or radically better. I would, stay out for this round and not worry about jumping into the CS16. For those of you who are thinking about one or the other one, the CS16 is probably going to be your safer choice up until we see other reviews and maybe other people with their playlists, with their sources, their cables or tips, whatever the magic was, where some people heard a fine frequency response and some heard, a cut off one. We'll wait to see some more reviews, but since I like both of them, it's kind of hard to put a, fail-safe recommendation that the CS16 is going to be guaranteed to be better than the ASX. Tuning-wise, I think just notching down the bass, I think, is going to be better, but if you still have this missing treble area that some people had with their sources, then, yeah, it's a bit risky to double down on a $90 IAM. So let me start with some of the basics, and we talked about some of these with the ASX as well. So open tips. So go back and read some of the C16 comments, and you'll see that some people review the C16, and then they changed the tips to more open tips and said, yeah, that was a really good idea. It sounds much better with open tips. I said the same thing about the ASX and the ASF. They both sound better with open tips, and a lot of it was that bass. On the ASX, too much bass. At least open the tips up. These are the set-in ear fits, so that controls the bass a little bit. That was a good combination. Volume is another thing that was mentioned on the C16. I don't think these really like low-volume listeners. That's just kind of a gut instinct because I had that problem with the ASF. It just didn't sound good at low volumes. And I sort of understood when people said it was missing a big chunk of the treble, and I really noticed that at lower volumes. But at higher volumes, I didn't. And that was always another one of those mystery things for me was, are they just low volume listeners? But I don't really think so. But I will say that they both sound better at higher volumes. So give it some volumes, give it some power. It very much likes that. So cable, I did run through a bunch of cables because the two should sound somewhat similar, but there are certain cables where the CS16 sounded muted, a little dull, and I didn't notice that with the ASX, but the same cables that I used on the ASX I tried first on the CS16, and it just had this really muted sound to it. Didn't really sound all that great. And then I switched over to the SEMA Electro, which I actually bought in 1111, and it's a great cable, and it sounds great on pretty much most sets, and I fully understand why people recommend their cables because it sounds great. So that's what I went with, and it just gives you a little more emphasis in those upper ranges. And if it takes away any of the bass from something that's a little bass heavy, I think it's a perfect fit in this case. So Johnny Cash's Hurt just happened to be that song where I kind of kept playing over and over with different cables, trying to get it to get his voice, a little forward, a little more vivid. The guitar shouldn't be as muted as it was. It all kind of came together with this cable, so that's why I ended up there. So like I talked about, the bass is just a little fat, a little flatter, it decays a little faster, doesn't overstay its welcome, less bloated. Whatever you want to describe the bass on the CS16, it's a notch down from what people thought was overbassed and overwarmed on the ASX. So fit problem, I do, this one was kind of weird. It almost feels like it inserts deeper than the ASX for me, and this little bottom point would actually hit the bottom of my ear. And I think, some of it is the Sedna ear fit. These are the shorts, so it actually inserts maybe a little deeper than the normal ear fit. So, it's not horrible, but the more I inserted it in and the more my ear rubbed against this flat part, the more it would, and after about 2 hours, it would sort of be noticeably irritable. So I would usually kind of stop after about 2 hours, so I wouldn't necessarily call it a fit problem, but do be aware that these are a little chunky shells, and if you have smaller ears, do think twice about that. So let's kind of get into the sound, and we'll talk about the bass first. Like I said, not as flat as at that graph that I showed, but not that ASX level. It decays faster, but even for me, it's still a little bit more than I expected. And I almost wish that this was the CS16 was what the KZ version sounded like, and then CCA did a more refined version of that and even brought the bass down a little bit more. And I wish it was a little flatter, a little more well dosed, and I think that would attract, the CCA version would have attracted more people if it resembled more of a flatter bass, more analytical sound. But as it is now, it's better than the ASX on the bass side. But if you're still expecting a very flat, well-dosed bass, it's more like heavily dosed and just more controlled and not as persistent and sort of bleeding in as much for that warmth as it was on the ASX. So something, really heavy, that song Judith by A Perfect Circle, that opening bass guitar, drums, it comes across really heavy on this guy, and you'll raise your eyebrows and be like, oh, this thing has crushing bass just like the ASX, but listen until the vocals start, and then the whole thing balances out, and you sort of realize that it's in isolation, the bass is quite strong, but for the most part, during tracks, in the middle of tracks, especially when there's a big midsection, it actually kind of falls back into where it should be. And there's a real difference between that and the ASX, which tended to be a little more persistent in more places, and this one really falls back to about where it should be. But do be aware that it's not a light bass one. And Sonny Rollins' Come Gone, if you've ever listened to that track, it's sort of split half and half. He's on one side, there's a bass and a drum on the other side. And but so that bass and that drum solo, very almost a refined bass. It's very textured and shapely and tight. So where A Perfect Circle in Judith was this, you think it was going to go over the top, but then you hear this track and everything is kind of as you would expect it. It's just nice and tight, kind of a nice shape right around that bass line in the back, and then the drums have that sharpness to it because this thing has a little emphasis on the upper mids as well. So there's that really nice shine to it, that nice sharpness to it, and then there's a nice full drum sound as well. So really, really kind of, you get some really nice low end. So, but just be aware that there's sort of both sides to the bass. So the mids and the ASX, very similar. They had this engaging, energetic, very forward and clear and detailed. And these, they're barely warm. They're not analytical at all, but they're not overly warm like the ASX. They're kind of just about right, for me anyway. So the Smiths, stop me if you think you've heard this one before, the 2011 remaster. So the first thing that I actually listened to that song a lot. And on a normal V shape, especially on those pairs that people say, oh, the male vocals slid back, they're recessed, his voice, Morrissey's voice, always falls back. And it's one of those that I listen to a lot. I really talk about it because there's not too many sets that bring his voice forward enough to really enjoy it as much as it should be, on a pair, especially compared to a pair of desktop speakers. But this is a pair where his voice is very forward, really big, very nice. And so, again, right in the beginning, those drums, there's just a really solid thud to them. And if you listen really closely, on the right side, you'll hear that tambourine. The tambourine is like way off on the side. It's really wide. And it's clearly your first hint that the soundstage is really wide. And the tambourine is way off on the side, and it's really clear. And that was really unique. That was something I didn't hear on the ASX at all. And I'll probably go back and hear it now, but it just popped out on this set. So I think I cover, let's see, so his vocals, forward and clear. There's just that lovely brightness to this guy, and it's not peaky brightness. It's not like you hear a certain instrument and it just pops and makes you cringe. There's just an overall emphasis on the upper range, which is really, really nice, especially on bands and instruments and notes. All those attacks on from guitars and snare drums and pianos, that little sharp focus on that top end sounds really nice, and especially when it doesn't go over the top, it just adds a lot. And just in general, I would say the ASX, for music wise, I think I slid towards heavier bass sounds because it's a bassy place, and this one is very much in that midsection, upper midsection. And I thought bands, whether it's Perfect Circle or the Smiths, guitars, all that sounds really, really nice on the CS16. So another one that sounds really nice for a different reason. So Queen's, another one, Bites the Dust, and that's the Bohemian Rhapsody remaster of that version. So that beginning, it's got a really nice beginning too. But when you jump to about 1 minute and 5 seconds, and his voice should be super sharp, it should kind of crack across the soundstage, kind of like lightning. It's like really razor sharp. And so by reducing that bass and kind of reducing that warmth into something that's not analytical but barely warm, that voice is kind of a great match to this. You get a really, really nice sharp edge on Freddie Mercury's voice. And it's another one of those songs that I listen to a lot on a different pairs. And I don't mention it as much until you get a pair that has that fine edge to it. And the ASX, you caught really glimpses of that aggressive edge to it, and it was just sort of dulled down a little bit by that bass. But on this one, really, really nice, and that's just a really nice part of that song. And then you listen a little further, and you get more of those powerful drums at 140. So Gautier is someone I used to know. So that section between 48 seconds and a minute 33, where he goes from his sort of warmish lower voice right into that his upper voice, where it comes across as more powerful. It's in that upper range, and then you get those drums, kind of like that tambourine from the Smith song. It's far off to your right, but it's really clear. Like every drum hit is just playing off there in the side, but it's super clear. And it's just another one I noticed. I've noticed that one more so on other IEMs, but again, listening to his voice and these drums far off on the right, really, really nice. And then on that one, especially if you listen to it even further to 233 and hear that female voice, it's sort of light and airy and comes across really well on this pair. So treble, again, I'll say it's present. There's really nice details, something like those tambourines, quite detailed, but still, I think people who are really into treble heads are still going to have issues with it. It just doesn't hit a super high level, and perhaps it's muted for an all BA set. It's kind of hard to say where it would be, but is it missing? No, it's not missing. It's definitely there. And so this song, No Better Time by Peter Alexander, if you jump to about 1 minute, I love this part where the bass sort of fights against the strings, and the bass kind of drops lower and the strings are soaring higher, and the two pull apart, and it just sounds really nice because there's, again, this little emphasis on the upper mids into that range, the strings kind of hit that perfectly, and there's just a lot of power there in the strings, and they're not struggling to soar. It's just going there, and so really nice, cool song too. And then going back to Sonny Rollins, "Come Gone," those cymbals in the right ear. So he's continuously, hitting that cymbal over and over again. There's just a lot of detail there, and it sounds like someone is hitting it over and over again. Because of those slight variations of hitting a cymbal after it's already ringing, all that kind of comes through. So I think, as far as detail, I think that's all there in a treble. It's really nice. So staging, like I said, it's really nice because it's really wide, and I like a wide sound stage, spacious, and the vocal image tends to be really big, almost takes up the whole space, and instruments tend to pop out sort of right at your ear and go beyond your ear. That's sort of where they start. So you don't really get a sense of too many instruments starting behind the vocals. So imaging and really tracking where certain positions are for instruments, quite easy on this one because that stage is really wide. A little height to it, not as much height as I assumed there was going to be, but it's there. It's just not overly tall. And that big vocal image really helps on songs like The Smiths, where Morrissey's voice is just right there, front and center, detailed. Sounds great in that recording. So that's my long take on the CS16. I apologize. That one is pretty long, but I just wanted to cover a lot of the ASX CS16 comparisons as much as I could, and because it's important. These two are expensive sets, and I certainly don't want someone doubling down on something that they didn't like the first time. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.